1945. World War II is ongoing but finally winding down. Germany is on the brink of surrender. Italy long has already. But Japan fights on. The ship you are on is making her way through the war-torn Pacific Ocean, but she has been guaranteed safe passage, and she carefully has made her way around a minefield. She is massive, was built for luxury, and has survived direct attack from torpedoes before. Rumored to be inside her hull, a priceless cargo of gold and precious metals. It is a Japanese ship you are on, but due to an agreement with the United States, the ship is guaranteed safe passage, and the US knows what her route is. She sails with her lights on, and the ship is making regular check-ins on the radio and announcing her position so everyone knows she is a vessel not to be sunk. All is well. But then, due to a case of mistaken identity on the part of an overeager submarine captain, you have been attacked, and you are trapped below. All around you, the ship creaks and cracks as water floods the halls. Soon, the lights slowly begin to dim and burn out, and you are left trapped inside, deep within the vessel, in utter darkness, and it sinks out from underneath you. Out of the 2,000 people on board the ship with you, one will survive. The ship is the Maru, and this is the story of her horrific sinking. History is full of horrifying ship disasters. The Titanic, Lusitania, Arctic, Lord Spencer, the White Ship. But this is up there with the very worst, and most terrifying. Fog, overeagerness, fatal human errors will all contribute to one of the most needless losses of life in the Second World War. The Maru was laid down in 1941 and launched the next year, and completed the year after that. She was in service from 1943 to 1945. She was 502 feet long, had a beam of 66 feet, and weighed 11,249 gross registered tons. During World War II, the Imperial Japanese Navy requisitioned this luxury passenger liner for war service. She made multiple runs to Singapore throughout the war, carrying ammunition and supplies, as well as making trips carrying troops to Burma throughout 1943 and 1944. Maru was also part of the High 71 convoy and carried Japanese reinforcements to the Philippines during the war. She also made trips into the South China Sea. In August of 1944, Maru was actually part of a convoy that was attacked by the USS Rasher, Bluefish, and Spadefish. She was one of several ships torpedoed that night, but she was able to make a successful run to shallow water and beached herself there and was prevented from sinking. She was repaired in Singapore later and returned to Japan the next year. In January 1945, the Japanese and United States governments made an agreement with one another. Despite still being at war, they agreed to allow the safe passage of various ships with the task of carrying Red Cross and other relief supplies to American and other Allied POWs being held by the Japanese. Maru was one such ship. She was then painted green with large white crosses on each side of her hull, and other ships with this task also had their sailing schedules sent to all submarines with orders that they were to be left alone. This message was broadcast 3 times, 3 nights in a row. At night, the ship would sail with all running lights on and with special spotlights on and aimed at her crosses. It is now March 28, 1945. Maru is docked in Singapore, having delivered vital Red Cross supplies for Allied POWs, and she is now taking on hundreds of stranded merchant marine officers, military personnel, diplomats, as well as a likely cargo of nickel, rubber, lead, tin, and sugar, and possibly a few priceless items as well. According to some sources, military contraband was also smuggled aboard by the Japanese troops in secret, and some evidence of this would soon be floating on the ocean surface. Now, on March 28th, Maru is departing Singapore with cargo and her passengers. Knowing she has been guaranteed safe passage by the United States, she makes way and is due to arrive at her destination on April 4th. There are 2,071 people on board. For a few days, all is well. The ship is left alone as ordered, and she sends a radio message at noon on April 1st, announcing her position. This is the last message that would ever come from the ship. The USS Queenfish was a Baleo-class submarine, her namesake coming from the same fish found off the Pacific coast of North America. She was laid down in Maine in 1943 and launched in November of that year. She was able to achieve a speed of 20.25 knots on the surface and 8.75 when submerged. She could dive to 400 feet, was 311 feet long, and had a beam of 27 feet. Her patrols began in August of 1944, and during this patrol, she sunk the tanker Chiyoda Maru north of the Philippines at 21 degrees 21 minutes north, 121 degrees 6 minutes east. Throughout her patrols over the next 8 months, she would sink 6 more Japanese ships, including the aircraft escort carrier Akitsu Maru in November 1944. The other vessels she sank included the passenger and cargo vessel Toyoko Maru, the transport ship Manchu Maru, the cargo vessels Keijo Maru and Hako Maru, and the ex-gunboat Cho Jutsun Maru. Then that brings us to April 1945. She is on patrol in the Pacific Ocean, and the submarine spots what they believe to be a destroyer making her way through the fog. Commander of the Queenfish, Charles E. Laughlin, first spotted the ship on radar at 17,000 yards. Awa Maru is sailing at 17 knots, and her visibility is down to 200 yards. Awa Maru is not blowing her horn, one of the signs that she was not to be torpedoed or attacked under the international treaty. And due to her heavily loaded cargo hold, Awa Maru is low in the water and appears smaller than she really is on radar. Laughlin slows his ship down to 4 knots and swings her around to take a shot at the unknown ship. Moving into a distance of 1,200 yards, using radar range and bearing, he orders 4 torpedoes to be fired. He has not actually seen the ship he is shooting at. All 4 torpedoes strike the Awa Maru. She sank in 2 minutes. Awa Maru goes down in 200 feet of water and crashes to the ocean floor. 4 gaping holes in her hull, this once beautiful, luxurious ship now a wreck on the ocean floor. She takes with her all those on board, save one. Kentaro Shimoda, the captain's personal steward, was the sole survivor of the sinking. It was the 3rd time he was the sole survivor of a torpedoed ship. None of the others among the crew, and none of the passengers, survived. Also around this time in history are when the fossils of the Peking Man, which were last known to be in Singapore, disappear. What happened to them is unknown, but it is theorized that they went the same way as the fossils on the Mount Temple did, because it is thought that a very probable explanation for the disappearance of the fossilized bones of this human ancestor is that they likely went down with the ship. A true blow to scientists studying human origins and extra salt in the wound of this tragedy. It is very likely they were completely obliterated in the initial explosions, if they were indeed on board. Let it go by safely was the order given to the submarine captains if they saw the Awa Maru, along with the description of her. What was Laughlin's reaction to this? "This is the most stupid dispatch I have ever seen in my life. It's addressed to every submarine from Australia to north of Japan. How the hell are we supposed to know where the Awa Maru is?" It was later stated in official records after the sinking, she, the Awa Maru, was carrying a cargo of rubber, lead, tin, and sugar, 1,700 merchant seamen and 80 first-class passengers, all survivors of ship sinkings, were being transported from Singapore to Japan. The survivor said no Red Cross supplies were on board, they having been previously unloaded. Queenfish never once saw the ship through the fog. Her crew merely saw her blip on radar blink out once she sank. When Kentaro Shimoda was picked up by the Queenfish, he told them who they had torpedoed, and she searched for more survivors, but found none. It had already been 6 hours after Kentaro had been rescued by then, and no one was left to save, if they would have even allowed themselves to be. Only Kentaro allowed himself to be plucked from the sea. More survivors had been at the scene earlier, but refused rescue attempts. Some even dove down into the oily water and drowned themselves. By the end of her second search over a day later, Quintero was still the only survivor. When news reached the mainland from her captain, Queenfish was ordered back to port. All the submarine found at the scene of the sinking was 2,000 bales of barbed rubber floating in the sea, which were seized as evidence of the ship carrying contraband. Queenfish's captain was relieved of command, was tried by court-martial, and convicted of negligence in obeying orders. He never again would command a submarine and received a letter of admonition from the Secretary of the Navy. Queenfish went on to rescue 13 airmen 100 miles west of Iwo Jima a few weeks after the sinking of the Maru. She would later sink an unnamed Japanese fishing vessel on July 4th, 1945. She would be stationed at Midway, preparing for another patrol when the war ended. She was sunk as a target in 1963. The U.S. government offered, through neutral Switzerland, to replace Maru with a ship of similar proportions to her. A furious Japan demanded a full reimbursement of $45 million for the ship and $7.25 million for the goods and lives, bringing the total to a $52.5 million demanded payment. In spring of 1949, the Japanese government abandoned all compensation rights related to the sinking of the Maru as a show of appreciation for the rebuilding efforts by the United States in Japan following the end of the war. In 1977, the wreck of the Maru was located 10 miles off the coast of China. Throughout 1979, 1980, and 1981, thousands of artifacts and human remains were returned to Japan by the Chinese salvage team, who were searching for a rumored cargo of billions worth of gold. No such cargo was ever actually on board the ship. It is the morning of April 15th, 1912. The North Atlantic Ocean is littered with ice, large bergs that loom high over even the mightiest of ships. Brave vessels plow their way through the hazard and the tightly packed bergs. And drifting among them on this morning are bodies. Hundreds of bodies, from the wealthy and well-dressed, the immigrants, to those who look like crew members. All are now floating on the ocean this morning. Because last night, the RMS Titanic sank. On April 14th, 1912, the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg on her maiden voyage. She sank 2 hours and 40 minutes later on April 15th. Since then, she has captivated us all, generation after generation, but why? Why does this 100-plus-year-old ship captivate us? Why did it seem like she had a life of her own that was cruelly snatched away before she could live it? Why are we still drawn to her? Why has she not been forgotten? In part, I think it's because the disaster is seen as a glorious one, of duty to the last and valor to the very end, of stories of great tragedy and partings, of lovers refusing to leave each other to the very end, and of impossible reunions. The sheer amount of stories that played out on her that night almost makes it seem unreal that it all could have happened on one ship in less than 3 hours. There were valiant acts of heroism, the legacy of which still live on today, kidnappings and panic. All the while, several ships came daringly dashing into the same ice field that doomed the Titanic to try and save the liner's passengers, while what seemed to be a cruel act of God was playing out. Many of her stories have been told over and over again, but many more have not. While the Titanic has not been forgotten, some of her stories have been. So today, the anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic, we will be taking a peek into the windows of the ship and across her decks at some of the little remembered moments from that night, the little pieces that slipped through the cracks of the Titanic story, of people you don't hear about, where they were, what they saw, and in some cases, how they died. These accounts can all be found in the book On a Sea of Glass and A Night to Remember, and we are going to start with that fateful collision at 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, 1912. I've covered a lot of ship stories, famous and obscure, on this channel, but I've never done a video about the Titanic, and it seems like the perfect time to do so. So these are a few of the forgotten stories that played out on the Titanic 112 years ago today. I will be telling you the stories of some of the people who were there that are often overlooked, synced up with looks at what some of the more well-known individuals were doing at the same time. At 11:40 p.m., Titanic's lookouts spotted something ahead. Looming in the dark was a black shape only visible because it was blocking out the stars behind. As the infamous words, "Iceberg right ahead!" were shouted out, over 2,000 other stories were playing out at that exact moment across the ship. For 30 seconds, her lookouts and officers on duty watched as she drew nearer to the berg, but it looked like she would get out of the way quick enough. But then Titanic grazed alongside the iceberg. As Titanic plowed alongside the iceberg, George Reeves was exiting a bathroom on A deck and felt a slight shudder run through the ship, enough to lightly rattle a glass on a table. Some said it was like a grinding sound coming from deep inside Titanic. "Isn't it funny? We're landing," one tired passenger thought. Meanwhile, others felt a more noticeable shake. Night baker Walter Belford had just finished making rolls for the next day and set them down, only for them to be knocked from the counter and fall crashing to the floor when the shake went through the ship. Other passengers across Titanic all had various other reactions, and some felt the slight shake, and others felt a more pronounced violent rattle instead. First-class passengers Edwin and Susan Kimball both heard a scraping sound, and then all of a sudden ice came pouring in through their open porthole. Dr. Washington Dodge and his wife Ruth were both jarred awake as well. Ruth thought the jolt was like the one she'd felt at the beginning of the San Francisco earthquake. While their son slept through it, the two parents were immediately awake due to the shaking, perhaps because they lived in San Francisco and were prone to being alert for shaking in the middle of the night. Gladys Sherry and Lucy Martha were both jolted awake by what they said sounded like an awful bang. Meanwhile, down deeper inside the ship, third-class passenger Eugene Daly had just fallen asleep after chatting with his cabin mate about what they hoped they could achieve in America when a sound like thunder jolted him awake. He rushed outside, all but running into a steward, who assured him nothing was wrong. He returned to his cabin shortly afterward. Another passenger named Imanita Shelley and her mother were startled out of their dreams by a dreadful sensation, and it caused the stopping of the engines. Meanwhile, for Seaman Walter Bryce, who was relaxing near the seaman's mess on C deck, the shake was only like a vibration under his feet, far from the violent crash like thunder or intense shake that toppled people from their bunks. Steward Walter Nicholas also described the collision as a vibration that awoke him. He recalled later, after the collision, some of the other stewards did want to get up and see what happened. However, unable to contain his curiosity, he put on his coat and went out to have a look at what was happening. He said it was all black outside and that he couldn't see anything save for ice scattered on the deck. In an ominous moment with hindsight, he never saw the berg, only what it left. He and the few others who had come up for a look went back down the same crew working staircase they'd come up. No one believed anything was wrong, and he and the others were glad to be back in their quarters and out of the bitter cold. Everybody believed in her, Nicholas later said, attesting to the crew's confidence in Titanic. He and some of the others did stay awake talking about what had happened. They had no idea that, further forward, water was already rising, that the passenger baggage area on G deck was flooding, and that some of the other stewards were hearing from firemen that the watertight doors were closed. William Ward, a mess steward, also felt the collision and opened his porthole to have a look outside. And the blast of air was so cold he immediately closed it and climbed back into his warm bed. Passenger Edith Rosenbaum, meanwhile, felt a series of tremors that grew more intense run through the ship when the collision occurred and saw the iceberg pass by her cabin window, eerily describing it as a ghostly wall of white that passed the ship, and immediately she ran out on deck, stopping only to grab a coat on the way. Antoinette Flegenheim, a widow who at one time lived in New York, was also jarred awake by the iceberg collision and immediately got up, determined to ascertain what had happened. The clock struck 11:41, and the iceberg passed by the Titanic. Many passengers began wandering around asking what was happening. Some kicked some of the ice that had spilled on deck. "Come and amuse yourself," they called, and others even took some pieces as souvenirs. Some saw the iceberg, but most dismissed any notion of danger, and others assumed things like Titanic had thrown a propeller blade as the explanation for the shudder that had shaken the ship. "Why have we stopped?" Lawrence Beasley asked the steward as he stepped out of his room. The steward answered that he assumed it wasn't anything much. Other passengers were asking questions and receiving various answers. "There's talk of an iceberg, ma'am, and they have stopped not to run over it," Steward Bishop explained to Miss Arthur Ryerson. "We've struck an iceberg, a big one, but there's no danger. An officer told me so," Harvey Collier's wife said to him when he asked her guest what was going on. "You worry too much," third-class passenger Elias Nicola Yard was telling his 14-year-old sister, who had been startled awake by the collision with the iceberg. The two children were traveling without their parents. However, little did any of them know, the iceberg had torn open 6 watertight compartments. Titanic could float with 4 flooded, but not 5. From that moment, no matter what anyone did, no matter how they sliced the numbers, the answer was always the same. Thomas Andrews, the builder of the Titanic, would tell her captain she would sink, and he only would give her an hour or so. Titanic, a small speck of light compared to the oceans she was steaming over, was alone in the North Atlantic Ocean, and she was dying. "What have we struck?" Captain Smith asked First Officer William Murdoch when he rushed onto the bridge, having also been awakened in the collision. "An iceberg, sir," Murdoch answered. "I put her hard to starboard and run the engines full astern, but it was too close. She hit it. I intended to port around it, but she hit before I could do any more." "Close the watertight doors," Smith then ordered, and Murdoch's reply was immediate. "The doors are closed, sir." As the captain and his officers began to assess the ship, the signs were already becoming noticeable. Titanic was already listing to starboard by as much as 5 degrees. A few minutes after the collision, Dr. Dodge went up on deck to see what was going on. He spotted some steerage passengers on the forward deck kicking around some of the ice, and he ran into 2 stokers and asked them what was happening. "Well, sir, water is pouring into the stokehold," they told him. Dodge now thought the situation might be more serious than he'd first thought, and he headed back to his stateroom to tell his wife what he'd heard. By 11:50, some others began to notice that things were not right. Forward in the ship's bow, Lance Trimmer Samuel Hemming heard a strange sound and left his bunk and made his way far forward as he could, and he found that the sound was the hiss of air escaping from the forepeak locker, where the anchor chains were reeled in. Below him in that room, water was gushing in so fast that it was forcing the air up the shafts and out. Edith Rosenbaum, meanwhile, had been mingling with some of the other passengers investigating the ice, and finally left the deck. Someone even suggested that they have a snowball fight with it, but she found it too cold and headed back to her stateroom and prepared to go back to bed. Just as she was about to climb into bed, there was a knock at the door. She opened it and saw a man she knew standing outside. "There's orders to put on lifebelts," he told her. "I didn't think that you'd heard," he added. "What in the world for?" Edith asked him. "I haven't an idea," the friend answered. What had happened, as Thomas Andrews was learning, was the Titanic had multiple sections of damage opened along her hull by the iceberg. The longest segment we know now was 39 feet in length. The iceberg popped open the rivets and created a series of small open seams in the hull, allowing water to flood into the first several compartments. The situation, however, was still not clear to anyone. Not fully. Not yet. Now, to give a little context on what else was happening on the ship at this time, shortly after 12 that morning, Thomas Andrews met with Captain Smith. Andrews had just come up from inspecting the mailroom and informed the captain that at least 3 compartments were already flooding. The two men then separated, and Andrews continued his inspection while Smith went back to the bridge. Passengers who saw Smith said his face was very serious and very grave. Around this time, Edith Rosenbaum wondered about her trunk of Paris fashion she had stored down in the holds. "If the Titanic sinks, will they transfer the luggage?" she said. "Miss," her bedroom steward, Robert Wareham, replied solemnly, "if I were you, I'd go back to your room and kiss your lovely things goodbye." "Then you think this boat is going to sink, Wareham?" she asked. "No one thinks anything at a time like this. We can only hope and pray," was Robert's answer. Robert Wareham would not survive the night. Thomas Andrews, meanwhile, was finding ever more alarming sights and signs as his inspection continued. There was no one on board who knew the Titanic as well as he did. As Walter Lord described him in his book A Night to Remember, if anybody could figure out the situation, here was the man. However, Andrews must have found that this was a situation where he could not help the beautiful girl that he had designed, his pride and joy, the ship he had been seeking out any lingering imperfections on only hours prior. The situation unfolding deep within her must have been both somber, terrifying, and disturbing to put together. As the realization slowly set in on just how seriously damaged Titanic was and what the reality of it meant, Andrews met up with Smith again and gave his report. The first 5 compartments were flooded uncontrollably, and he had seen water slowly flooding into the 6th compartment as well. The pumps were keeping the water down in that room, but in the first 5 compartments it was completely uncontrollable. We'll never know exactly what they said in that meeting, as both men would die that night, but they both came to the same conclusion. As I said earlier, no matter how you looked at it, no matter how you sliced the numbers, the Titanic would fill so much in the bow that the weight of the water would pull her down by the head, low enough that the water would spill over the tops of the forward 5 watertight compartments and into the next, and next, back and back as she got lower, with no way to stop it. The process could be slowed, but not stopped. As it is famously said in James Cameron's 1997 movie, and A Night to Remember in 1958, it was a mathematical certainty. Titanic was going to sink, and Andrews now gave her an hour to an hour and a half until she would likely capsize and founder. I can't imagine the weight on Smith as he heard that, or what had to have been going through Andrews' mind at the same time, but the captain at once ordered the boats to be made ready and launched, and it was time to get as many people off the Titanic as they could while they had time. He then immediately left and went to the Marconi wireless room and told Jack John Phillips and Harold Bride to send out a call for assistance, something they'd been told earlier in the night to be ready to do at a moment's notice. The regulation call for help, Smith told them to send. Just that. Meanwhile, the passengers were still mostly unawares of what was happening, but they now began to receive some alarming or confusing orders. Lawrence Beasley was interrupted while reading in his cabin around this time by a loud shout from above. "All passengers on deck with your life belts on!" For the first-class passengers, the knocks on their doors around this time were mostly polite and courteous. Here, stewards had fewer passengers to attend to and could devote more time to each of them. In third class, however, most were awoken by harsh pounds on the doors and shouts to get up and put lifebelts on. Siblings Elias and Jamila Nicole Yard had gone back to sleep, but were awakened again by a knock at the door. An elderly man who had taken a fatherly role for the siblings during the voyage, again they were traveling without their parents on this crossing, was at the door. He kindly said, "Come out of your cabin and go to the upper deck. Don't bother about taking your belongings now. You'll get them later." In second class, Imanita Shelley was ringing over and over for her steward. Finally, another steward came to the door and reassured her that nothing was the matter. "Nothing, ma'am. We had a slight collision, but it is all right now, and the orders are for you to return to your beds and rest content, he said, going down the line of rooms to deliver the same message. When Dr. Dodge returned to his stateroom, room A34, he went in and told his wife everything he'd seen on deck. He also noted that the Titanic was still stationary. The engines were still stopped. Now more convinced something was wrong, he left the room again and found their bedroom steward. The steward told him, "The order has just come down. All passengers need to get into their lifebelts and go on deck." Dodge asked if it was a joke, but the steward confirmed it wasn't, so he sprang back to his stateroom door and told his wife to dress warmly, and then they roused their young son, Washington Dodge Jr. Dr. Dodge made sure to grab 3 lifebelts from on top of their wardrobe before they left the room. Shortly before 12:15, Steward Nicholas said another steward came into their room with orders to go up on top. That meant to report to the positions assigned to us in the lifeboat drill. His assigned boat was number 15. Edwin and Susan Kimball, meanwhile, were both up on decks with their lifeboats before 12:30, along with some of their friends and fellow passengers, and they saw only a few other people on deck, and the officers having great difficulty getting people to get into the lifeboats. The group would all eventually get into Lifeboat 5 and leave the Titanic, and they all survived the night. George Reams, meanwhile, was talking with his brother-in-law, Joseph Loring, when Thomas Andrews passed by them and told them they needed to put their lifebelts on. Reams then went down to his cabin and put on some warm clothes and met up with Joseph again. The two opted to stick together. Saloon steward William Ward, meanwhile, had been sent forward with some other stewards to the salon to see if any passengers were lingering there and to bring any lifebelts they found back up. He searched for anyone in the forward first-class section of the ship located on D deck, but found no one. He did, however, collect 7 lifebelts that had been abandoned, put one on for himself, and then took the others and headed back up top. He helped some passengers he happened across properly fasten their own, and then he headed up to inquire about the situation at his assigned boat, number 7. At boat 7, he found things quite orderly in that a lot of the passengers still saw the whole thing only as a kind of joke. The passengers were calling out things to friends leaving in lifeboats like, "When you get back, you'll need a pass. You can't get back on board tomorrow morning without a pass." This was also around the time that Benjamin Guggenheim, accompanied by his valet, said to Steward Etches, who noted that they had removed their lifebelts, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen. If anything should happen to me, tell my wife in New York that I've done my best in doing my duty." He also said, according to another steward who saw him at a later time afterward, "I played the game straight to the end, and that no woman was left on board this ship because Ben Guggenheim was a coward." At roughly 12:20, Lucy Martha, also known as the Countess of Roth, and Gladys Sherry, her cousin, were on deck when none other than Captain Smith personally asked them to go put their lifebelts on. They returned to their stateroom but could not find any lifebelts. A passing man and steward helped them eventually find them under the bed. Once the two ladies were dressed, the steward assured them that they had time. They then headed back up on deck. By 12:27, Titanic's distress call was being sent out by her wireless operators, and her officers were all on deck making things ready there. The initial process was slow, though. Getting things moving took a while because most of the crew did not know Titanic was sinking and did not even know the situation was serious. "I'm sure it is just a precaution," many were no doubt thinking. The steam was being released from the ship was also so loud that it meant no one could really hear anything, even when shouting. For example, Second Officer Lightoller had to cup his hands over Smith's ear and shout, "Hadn't we better get the women and children into the boat, sir?" Smith heard him and nodded. "Yes. Put the women and children in and lower away," he said. The Dodge family had come up to the boat deck as Boat 7 was being loaded. Dr. Dodge personally fastened the lifeboats onto his family and made sure they were on right and tight. But he hesitated putting them in a lifeboat despite the cause for women and children. He was still unsure if his family was safer on Titanic or in the lifeboats. Finally, though, he chose to put his family in a lifeboat. He led them to Lifeboat 5 and had them climb in. Young Dodge Jr. remembered his father staying behind. The officer said it was women and children only, and a few moments later, the young boy heard the officer say he was going to go below decks and get a gun if the pushing didn't stop. Dr. Dodge's family were on board Lifeboat 5 when it left Titanic. They would all survive the night. Dr. Dodge's fate, however, was not so certain. He remained on Titanic. Later in the night, he found himself further aft on the ship, near Boat 13. It was about an hour later at the time, when the Titanic was nearing her end, and a saloon steward named Frederick Dent Ray spotted Dodge near the boat. He knew the family. He'd been their steward on the Olympic before, and he asked him where his family was. Dodge told him they'd already gotten away in one of the boats. "You'd better get in here then," Ray then said, wanting to save Dodge, and he got behind the man and shoved him into the lifeboat. Ray then helped a larger woman into the boat who was crying, "Please don't put me in the boat. I don't want to go in the boat. I've never been in an open boat in my life. Don't let me stay in." "You have to go, and you may as well keep quiet," Ray said in response. This encounter was recreated almost word for word in the film A Night to Remember. Lifeboat 13 left Titanic at 1:43 a.m. loaded with 65 people. Among them was Dr. Dodge. He would survive the night too, as would Steward Ray. At 12:30, another steward burst into Imanita Shelley's room, giving a very different message than the one she'd gotten earlier. "All on deck with lifebelts on," he said, and then left again. Shelley and her mother both immediately dressed themselves. Imanita had taken a tour of the USS Kentucky once, and was shown how modern ships were near impossible to sink. Now frightened, as she and her mother hurriedly dressed, she asked, "Can it be that the ship is sinking? That this great leviathan of a ship can go down?" Shortly before 12:40, William Ward, who had been assigned to Boat 7, but not told to man it, left the boat, and instead went aft to help loading up Boat 9. He said he assisted to take the canvas cover off her. Lawrence Beasley was near the boat at this time by chance, and he reportedly watched the men take the cover off. Edith Rosenbaum, meanwhile, was in the first-class lounge at about 12:30. People were smiling around her, and her fears had been more or less forgotten. She was just being told by Washington Roebling II that the Titanic was unsinkable. But right as he said this, a deck officer came in and said, "Women and children will kindly proceed to the boat deck. Women and children only." Edith left Washington as he waited in the lounge. He would not survive the night. She trudged up on deck from the lounge alongside the other women and children. She said that there was so much confusion and indecision that she deemed the whole thing a joke and went back to the lounge. She'd stay there until sometime before 1, when she would again wander up to the deck after talking to a bridge officer. There, she actually ran into J. Bruce Ismay himself, who cried, "You? What the devil are you doing here? I thought all the women had left the ship." He then seized her by the arm, none too gently as she put it, and placed her into Boat A. Edith later said, "I screamed as I lurched into the craft, and at the same time I lost both my slippers. I remonstrated against going out in a lifeboat. Some of the men assisted me back on the deck again, where I recovered my slippers." Philip Mock, meanwhile, saw her as he was helping his own sister into the boat, and he finally persuaded her to leave the ship. "Miss," he said, "if you'll put your foot on my knee and your arm around my neck, I'll lift you to the rail, and you can jump in by yourself." "All right," Edith agreed. One of the sailors then took her toy pig, which she had gone back to her cabin to collect, refusing to leave her treasured item there, and threw it into the boat. Edith stepped in after it. Mock later escaped on another boat and was saved. Edith would also survive the night, and even visited the set of A Night to Remember years later as it was being filmed, and even met the actress playing her in the movie. But that meeting was far, far off from that night in 1912, and the Titanic was beginning her death throes. Antoinette Flegenheim had been loitering on deck for most of the night until about 1 a.m. At one point, she attempted to go below again and dress herself in a different outfit, but was prevented from going back down to her cabin. She was then among those who were loaded into Boat 7, and she survived the night. Earlier in the night, prior to 1 a.m., in his D-deck cabin, Lawrence Beasley was reading when a shout from above interrupted him. "All passengers on deck with your lifebelts on!" He put his book into his coat, along with a second one, put on his dressing gown, grabbed his life jacket, and headed up top. Beasley was stopped by a passenger who said that she didn't have her life jacket, and she asked him to come help her find it. Beasley went with her to F-deck, with her clinging to his arm in a vice-like grip. They eventually found a steward who showed them where they could find life jackets, and Beasley headed back up on deck. On deck, he found steam blowing out from one of the long pipes on the funnels, but noted that the ship still felt steady at this time. He described Titanic as absolutely still, however noticed that the lifeboats were being uncovered and watched intently. Just after 1, while he was standing near Boat 9, an officer came up and shouted, "All women and children, get down to the deck below, and all men stand back from the boats." Beasley spent the next little while watching tearful partings of couples on the boat deck, and it was only then that he began to wonder if the ship was in danger. Little did he know, deep below him in the depths of Titanic, the water was continuing to rise, flooding rooms and halls slowly but steadily, higher and higher up. It wouldn't be long before some down in the bottom of the ship noticed water coming down from above them as it began spilling over the bulkheads and flooding the compartment's back. Any doubts Beasley had as to the seriousness of the situation were dashed when, suddenly, a rush of light came from the forward deck. A hissing roar that made us all turn from watching the boats, and the rocket leapt upwards to where the stars blinked and twinkled above us. Titanic was firing rockets, and according to Beasley's words, anybody knows what rockets at sea mean. Shortly before 1 a.m., Eugene Daly had worked his way through the confining steerage hallways until he reached Maggie Daly's cabin. He pounded on the door and shouted, "Water is coming up and up rapidly!" Several other steerage passengers who had cabins forward in the ship had noticed water begin to trickle in even as they were getting dressed following the order to get up and go on deck. Maggie quickly got her clothes on and joined Eugene in the hallway, and they were joined by Maggie's cabin mate, Bertha Mulvihill, who grabbed her gold bracelet, cross, rosary beads, prayer books, and slipped them into her coat along with her inscribed timepiece, which was an engagement present from her husband Henry. She joined Eugene and Maggie out in the hallway, then went back inside the cabin and grabbed her life jacket, and then went back out and joined them again. Lifebelts in hand, they set off through the hallway, but at this point, there were jostling crowds gathering. Think how tightly packed they are in the 1997 movie for an idea of what this would have looked like. At around 1 a.m., the Countess of Roth and Gladys Sherry were both among those who climbed into boat number 8. They saw Captain Smith again. He asked, "Any more ladies?" They watched as one more lady separated from her husband and boarded boat number 8, along with a little girl as well. She wanted her husband to come, but he backed away from the boat. Smith called out again for women and children 2 more times, but no one came forward, and the boat lowered away. Seaman Thomas Jones was ordered by Smith to row in the direction of the light of another steamer that could be seen on the horizon, unload their passengers there, and return. This never happened, as the Californian was far too distant for this to be possible. Gladys Sherry and Lucy Martha, though, would both survive the night. At the time the boat was lowered, though, Gladys thought she had made a very foolish decision to exchange the warmth and safety of Titanic for a little lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Lucy Martha would take over the tiller of the lifeboat later in the morning and also help row it towards the Carpathia when it arrived to rescue them. She is remembered as one of the many heroes of that night. She died in 1956 at the age of 77. Between 1 and 1:30, Boat 9 was being swung out. William Ward was still there. Ward and others helped lower the boat until it was level with the boat deck, when he noticed a sailor came along with a bag and threw it in the boat. He claimed he'd been sent by the captain to take charge, but he was firmly ordered out of the boat. Finally, either First Officer Murdoch or Chief Purser McLeroy came over and asked, "Are you all ready?" When he received word that the boat was, he added, "Pass in the women and children that are here into that boat." William Ward was among those who helped load the boat, and they found that there was difficulty in the task. A French lady had fallen and hurt herself as she boarded. It was quite a step down into the bottom of the boat, and in the dark they could not see where they were stepping, he said. And afterward, an old lady made a fuss about boarding. She absolutely refused to get into the boat. She ran back into the companionway. One of the crew members attempted to go after her, but she had already gone downstairs. Boat 9 finally lowered away at 1:30 a.m. with 40 people on it. Titanic would sink 50 minutes later. William Ward was among those on board the lifeboat, and would later be among those who argued against going back for people in the water after the ship sank, saying it would be madness to return. He would survive the night. Sometime between 1:30 and 2, Lawrence Beasley was above the starboard boat deck when he heard someone shout, "Any more ladies?" from below. Looking down, he saw boat 13 coming level with the rail of B deck, loaded nearly full to its capacity. Those in the boats called out again for any ladies, but when they received no answer, they looked right at Beasley and called, "Any more ladies on your deck?" "No," Beasley called back. "Then you'd better jump," they called back. Beasley set himself down on the deck and let himself slide off, landing near the stern of the boat. A few other last-second arrivals were rushed up moments later as well. 2 women who had been found, who likewise jumped, and then a husband, wife, and young baby also all tumbled down into the boat. The boat was then ordered to be lowered away, and all those inside were lowered into the sea. Lawrence Beasley survived the night. 10 minutes before 2 a.m., John Jacob Astor and Archibald Gracie were helping pregnant Madeline Astor board lifeboat number 4. John asked permission to accompany his wife given her delicate position, but was told, "No, sir, no men are allowed on these boats until women are loaded first." Elias and Jamila Nicole Yard were right behind them. They had managed to find their way up onto the boat deck and were frightened beyond belief. They saw the Astors say goodbye, and then it seems that John Jacob Astor himself was the one who spotted and helped Elias and Jamila into the lifeboat. The siblings were both placed into the boat, and they would survive the night. A little bit earlier, just after 1:30, a steward entered the first-class smoking room to see if any passengers were still there, and he saw a man standing by the fireplace, his arms folded, and he was silent as he stared up at a painting. It was Thomas Andrews. He was lost in thought, likely contemplating everything as the reality hit him. He didn't even react when the steward asked him, "Aren't you going to have a try for it, Mr. Andrews?" The steward left when Andrews didn't answer him. Unlike many of the films, which last show Andrews in this room before the ship sinks, in reality he did not stay there until the end. He was last seen on deck helping to the very end when the Titanic took her sudden plunge down. He was never seen again after that, though. Captain Smith likewise vanished around the same time, along with Officer Murdoch and Wilde. Some say they saw Smith and Andrews leap into the sea, and others said they saw Murdoch get washed off the deck. None of them survived. When Boat 11 left Titanic at 1:35, Walter Bryce was among the crew on board and manning the boat. He'd helped swing her out and then load her with passengers. He would survive the night. On the aft end of the starboard boat deck, steward Walter Nicholas was standing with a few other crew members, waiting for orders. He saw the officer nearby had a revolver in his hand, another ominous sign, but to him everything still seemed calm. "We didn't know even then that anything was seriously the matter," Nicholas said. However, it wasn't long after that Titanic suddenly began to list alarmingly onto her port side. Yet when Boat 15 was lowered, Nicholas said, "None of us had any idea that the Titanic would sink." They were still confident in her, and they'd heard a rumor that Olympic was speeding towards them to help. This was true, but Titanic's sister was hundreds of miles away from her dying sibling. Once Boat 15 was away from the Titanic, Nicholas had to have realized the truth, though. He would have seen just how far down by the head Titanic was by this time. He said he could see the starboard propeller beginning to stick out of the water. He would survive the night. Eugene and Maggie Daly and Bertha Mulvihill reached the boat deck after Boat 13 was away from the ship. Eugene had ended up in a fight for a life jacket down on Scotland Road. After asking a man for one, his was on but under his coat, and he was asking one for Maggie. But the man calmed down once he realized they wanted it for the lady. Eugene then tried to lead them up, but we were all held down in steerage, which seemed to be a lifetime. Finally, the 3 reached the boat deck but saw no boats were going away on the starboard side. They were told a boat was being filled on A deck, and Eugene rushed to get Maggie and Bertha there. They made it, and he got them in, and then climbed in as well. An officer tried to order him back onto the Titanic, but Daly later said, "The officer called on me to go back, but I got in. Life was sweet to me, and I wanted to save myself. They told me to get out, but I didn't stir. Then they got a hold of me and pulled me out." Eugene had vowed to keep his cousin Maggie safe in the crossing, and only attempted to save his life after they were in the boat first. Maggie later said, "I would never have been saved but for Eugene. He fought very hard for our lives." They were also in boat 15, and Bertha said that Titanic was going down slowly yet surely. I had marked in my mind's eye 2 portholes on the vessel. I watched the water come to them, pass them, and swallow them up from sight. I was fascinated. Walter Nicholas, Maggie Daly, and Bertha Mulvihill would all survive the night in boat 15. Shortly before 1:45 a.m., Imanita Shelley and her mother were still on the Titanic. They were up on deck by now, near lifeboat 10, when a steward suddenly ran to them. "Young lady," he said, "for God's sake, get into this lifeboat they are ready to launch. It's the last one on board, all the rest are launched, and you must not take chances." The Strauss couple themselves were with them, and they helped Shelley to the edge of the deck as a crewman helped her mother into the boat. Shelley, however, would have to jump. She said a goodbye to the Strauss couple and leapt across the gap into the lifeboat. Miss Strauss smiled and waved her. Imanita said it was a serene moment amid the turmoil of Titanic sinking. Ida Strauss was not trying to get away and doing all to help the rest of us escape in comfort. Of course, Miss Strauss had refused to leave her husband earlier in the night when he had tried to get her into boat 8, but she refused to go, famously saying to him, "We have been living together for many years. Where you go, I go." Mr. and Mrs. Strauss both died in the sinking. Isidore's body was later recovered by the CS Mackay-Bennett. Ida would never be found after the Titanic sank. They were last seen on deck, arm in arm, and Ida reportedly said, "I will not be separated from my husband. As we have lived, so we will die together." Witnesses said the scene was a most remarkable exhibition of love and devotion. Amanita Shelley and her mother, however, survived the night. It was around this time that Captain Smith again visited wireless operators John Phillips and Harold Bride. She would not last very long, Bride said, Smith said to them. The engine rooms were taking water, and that the dynamos might not last much longer. The wireless signal was growing weaker, the two noticed, and they set all the settings on the wireless set to their max power settings, trying to just get a little extra out of the Titanic while she still had enough. Phillips was worried by this point that they weren't even transmitting anything anyone could hear anymore, but he and Bride kept at it. It was 8 minutes to 2 a.m. Titanic had less than 30 minutes left. By 2:02 a.m., Phillips was in communication with the Frankfurt and the Carpathia still. Outside, they could hear people rushing on the deck. "We are abandoning ship," Phillips told the Carpathia after again telling the Frankfurt to keep out due to her wireless operator constantly interrupting Phillips's own messages. "You are a fool. Keep out and do not interfere with our communication," he had sent. But the power was failing. They no longer were receiving any replies. But Phillips still stayed, tapping on the driver. "He was a brave man," Bride said. "I learned to love him that night, and I suddenly felt a great reverence to see him standing there, sticking to his work while everybody was raging about. I will never live to forget the work of Phillips for the last awful 15 minutes. At around 2:15, the Titanic, which had been settling slowly, suddenly righted herself onto an even keel. A lucky escape, as most ships tend to fully roll over eventually, but Titanic managed to keep herself upright to the very end, and took a sudden plunge down. It was so sudden that it caused a huge wave of water to wash up the ship's starboard deck, sweeping away many of the well-known people on the ship. This is around the time that many individuals such as Murdoch were last seen. Samuel Hemming was on deck around this time, and he was the last person we know of to have seen 6th Officer Moody trying to launch Collapsible A. Hemming would later be pulled from the water after the ship sank, described as being in a very bad way, but he would survive the night and make a full recovery. George Reams, meanwhile, along with Joseph Loring, were on deck when the Titanic took a nosedive, as Reams described. Just before this, Loring said to Reams, "George, if you survive, look after my babies. If I live, you will not have to worry about Mary." Loring wanted to head aft as chaos was breaking out among the passengers around them, but Reams told him it would mean death. Loring insisted, saying he couldn't swim well enough to stay where they were. Having no choice, the brother-in-laws parted ways, and Reams leapt off the Titanic. He never saw Joseph again. He would be among those who struggled in the water, and he would call it, the cries were of atrociously grim, mysterious, supernatural kind. He would survive the night aboard Collapsible A. When the Titanic suddenly began to plunge, Eugene Daly was still on board. He'd given some personal possessions to another woman boarding a boat earlier in the night, begging she pass them to his family if he didn't make it, and that if he did, he would seek her out. When the ship plunged, he went suddenly from standing on the deck above the water to being knee-deep, then waist-deep in the freezing 28-degree water. Daly said people were rushing around as the waves washed up the ship as she went down. Finally, he jumped overboard and fell among the mass of people in the water. Everything I touched seemed to be woman's hair, he later said. Children crying, women screaming, and their hair in my face. My God, if I could only forget those hands and faces that I touched. I looked down the forecastle and saw the most horrible, heart-rending scenes I have ever witnessed. There were women and children and firemen and stewards all fighting, shrieking for help in their death struggles. I swam away from the ship as the forwards was sinking. I did not feel any suction. When he looked back at the Titanic, he saw her funnels going under. He saw people being sucked down into them as they went under, like flies, he said. It was about 2:17 a.m. at that time, and the sounds of shattering china and glass could be heard, which grew to a sound like a rumbling explosion. Finally, Daly managed to reach the overturned collapsible B. There was only enough room amid the crowd already on board for him to pull himself halfway out of the water. He was so cold and close to unconsciousness, he was hardly aware of the stern of the Titanic looming over him. He finally noticed and said, "Her stern stuck up high. I thought she would fall over on us as she seemed to be swinging around, but she did not." He was in the water for a long time. His fingers were blue, but his overcoat, soaked as it was, might have kept some heat in. And he was finally hauled aboard the overturned boat when another person on board died. He would survive the night. Night Baker Walter Belford also leapt off the ship when she began to plunge, jumping overboard as far as he could. He cannonballed into the ocean in a sitting position. He would survive the night as well. According to a night to remember, whenever he remembered the stabbing cold of the water, described like 1,000 knives stabbing you all over your body by another survivor, and the same way in the 1997 movie, he always sucked in his breath. Meanwhile, Titanic was dying. Her bow was going down and her stern was rising. Lawrence Beasley later described the sight as Titanic revolving apparently around a center of gravity just astern of amidships. Second Officer Lightoller dived into the sea from the roof of the officers' quarters and was sucked down against a vent shaft and pinned there by water rushing in. But a blast of hot air freed him, and he was able to swim away. He would survive the night. Meanwhile, the water was rising on Titanic's decks as she went down, faster and faster. Her lights had dimmed to a dull red as what little power left inside her failed. Then they went out, and Titanic broke in half. Her structure failed, and she tore herself apart into 3 main sections, the bow dropping down, the middle all but disintegrating, and the stern leveling out again for a moment. Then it too rose up, a black shape silhouetted against the stars. Though he did not realize the ship split into 2 main sections, Lawrence Beasley seemed to describe exactly that. It was partially a groan, partially a rattle, and partially a smash, and it was not a sudden roar as an explosion would be. It went on successively for some seconds, possibly 15 to 20. The sight of Titanic's stern rising back up and finally going under was described as Titanic turning her deck away from us, as though to hide from our sight the awful spectacle. Then, with the deadened noise of the bursting of her last few gallant bulkheads, she slid quietly away from us and into the sea. Now, even though the lights had failed by this point, some survivors, as an interesting note, such as Greaser Thomas Ranger, mentioned seeing a few little bulbs still burning in the stern section as the ship went down. There's no consensus on if any lights stayed on, but it is possible that there might have been a last gasp of electricity, as On a Sea of Glass puts it, after the ship broke in half. And it is possible that a few little lights stayed on even as the ship went down. Either way, 2:20 a.m., Titanic was gone. Mackay-Bennett was a transatlantic cable-laying and repair ship owned by the Commercial Cable Company. She was launched in September of 1884. She registered 2,000 gross registered tons. She was 270 feet long overall, and her beam was 40 feet, and her depth was 25 feet rounded up. She was notable for being built with steel and iron for her hull. Her keel was deep and designed to accommodate as much cable as possible and keep the ship stable when fully loaded with cables. She also had 2 rudders, one fore and one aft, to assist in her maneuverability capabilities. Cable layers lay underwater cable for communications, and in 1912, maintenance and repair of transatlantic telegraph cables were the main purpose ships like Mackay-Bennett served. Transatlantic telegraph cables were undersea cables running across the floor of the North Atlantic Ocean to establish telegraph communications between the continents. She could lay cable at a speed between 6 to 8 miles per hour. Modern cable layers still lay deep-sea cable, and today it's for purposes like electric power transmissions, telecommunication, and even military use. Modern cable layers still also have the same CS designation that their predecessors, like the CS Mackay-Bennett, had. Modern examples include the modern counterpart to her, the CS Innovator. The CS Hooper, meanwhile, was the very first purpose-built cable layer in the world, built more than a decade before the CS Mackay-Bennett. Seen here around 1900, Mackay-Bennett's service history began back in 1885. At the time, she was mostly on the European side of the Atlantic and was based in Plymouth, England. Writer Thomas Rattle served on the ship as her wireless operator and based some of his original short stories on his own experiences on the ship, which is relatable because I do the same thing with a lot of my stories and experiences I have in real life. So I like that. I like that little detail. Most of Mackay-Bennett's early career was routine, and there weren't really many recorded events to talk about. So we finally come to April 1912, when what she is most remembered for occurred. RMS Titanic sank in the early morning hours of April 15th, and 1,500 people died in the freezing Atlantic Ocean that night. The ship was gone, but the bodies of those she was carrying were left floating on the glassy ocean surface. And they couldn't just be left out there. It's something I never thought about when watching, say, the 1997 movie and seeing the bodies scattered across the ocean's surface, but I absolutely get why there was an attempt to recover as many of them as possible, and it surprises me that it never occurred to me that there probably was an attempt until just recently. At the time of the disaster, Mackay-Bennett was docked in Halifax. On April 17th, Mackay-Bennett became the main vessel White Star Line contracted for the job, and she set out to perform her grim task. She was capable of holding 125 coffins, she had supplies enough to embalm 70 other bodies, and had 100 tons of ice for preserving others. Titanic's passengers were floating throughout the ocean, and Mackay-Bennett set out to perform her duty to find as many of them as they could. She had an epic journey to get there, battling fog and stormy seas before reaching the site of the disaster. The fog and bad weather prevented the ship from reaching the site for 4 days, and 2 of the logbooks the crew were keeping especially for this operation still survive today and describe the harsh conditions and difficult task that followed. She reached the scene at night, and on April 20th, at 0600 local time, the recovery effort began. The crew, who were being paid double for this task, had to row out in smaller boats into the ice, the same ice field that Titanic's few lifeboats rowed out of on the morning of April 15th, to find the floating corpses, load them up, and bring them back to the ship. Among the bodies found were John Jacob Astor, recovered on April 22nd, and Isidor Strauss, but his wife, who famously said, "Where you go, I go," was never found. First-class passengers were embalmed and placed in coffins, stored in a cable locker. Second-class passengers were embalmed and stored wrapped in canvas. And third-class passengers, a total of 116 bodies, were buried at sea. Wallace Hartley's body was also found, as was the unknown child, a approximately 19-month-old baby whose identity wasn't known until 2008. The unknown child was not buried at sea. Mackay-Bennett recovered most of the bodies that were found, and of them 116 were buried at sea, but the total recovered was 306. No other ship recovered nearly that many. Those buried at sea were given a funeral service, overseen by Canon Kenneth Cameron, and of the 116 buried at sea, only 56 were identified. 190 bodies were housed within her when she set off back for home, far more than she had been provisioned to carry. She recovered 306 of the 328 bodies that were ever recovered after the sinking. The crew were given $100,000 by J.J. Astor's son for the recovery of his father, and they split it amongst themselves, each getting around $2,500. They used some of it to pay for a burial and headstone for the unknown child. The casket itself simply read, "Our Babe," and the stone read, "Erected to the memory of an unknown child whose remains were recovered after the disaster to the Titanic, April 15th, 1912. The crew attended the burial on May 4th, 1912. It would be almost a century before the child's name was known again. Clifford Crease, who was 24 years old at the time, and among those who helped recover the bodies, and the one who pulled the child's body from the water, visited the grave of Our Babe every year on the anniversary of the disaster. When he died in 1961, he was buried just steps away from the unknown child. I did not think I was going to be near to crying when I was writing this script, but as I was researching, that's a detail I've never heard before, and I just wanted to give it an entire dedicated segment because it more than deserves it. And I absolutely think that is a little story that needs to be told because I had never heard of it until I started researching for this, and I think that's a shame. The other bodies were taken to the ice rink of the Mayflower Curling Club in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It was the only site in the city that was large and cold enough for the task of preserving them. Of the more than 1,500 lost in the sinking of the Titanic, 328 total bodies were recovered. Mackay-Bennett recovered 306 of them, and 116 of those were buried at sea. The rest were never recovered. To start off the story, we have to go back to the beginning. Augsburg was ordered back in mid-October of 1895 by the German-Australian Steamship Company, or DADG. It placed the order for the ship at the Charles Connell and Company of Scotstoun on the River Clyde in Glasgow. Yard number 226 was her birthplace, and she was launched April 18th, 1896, and given the name Augsburg. She was completed on June 27th of the same year. Her code letters were RKLN, and this girl was 380 feet long. Her beam was 47 feet rounded up, and her depth was 20 feet rounded down. She displaced 4,287 gross registered tons, had a single screw, a 3-cylinder triple expansion engine, and could achieve a speed of 11 knots. Finally, she was registered in Hamburg. The cargo ship had a crew of 39. For the next several years, Augsburg had a fruitful career, carrying cargo that was more or less uneventful. She braved the hazards of the North Atlantic Ocean and carried cargo back and forth across it. Her story from these early days is not readily recorded. However, on December 16th, 1911, 5 years to the day before another ship we've talked about, the Mount Temple, sank, just felt like mentioning that, she left Hamburg. Her captain was Wilhelm Winter from Hamburg. She reached New York in early January 1912 and spent 4 weeks there. She was loaded with cargo consisting of kerosene and petroleum, along with other cargo, and left again on February 2nd, 1912, with either 37 or 39 crew members on board her. A February 3rd newspaper from the New York Tribune reported her departure in their Marine Intelligence section. As far as we know, the ship was never seen again, not even by a passing vessel. She was bound for Durban, and somewhere along that voyage from New York, she vanished off the face of the earth. Her arrival date of March 5th came, and when it did, there was no sign of her. Now, at first, most people wouldn't have been too worried. Ships were late all the time back then. Engines failing were not uncommon. But eventually she was reported as overdue. It's a tale we've heard many times before, Waratah probably being the best example, which vanished in the same area. Light cruiser SS Bremen set out to look for her. The Bremen was a ship that served the Royal Navy in the early 1900s and had been ordered back in 1898, and would later be sunk in World War I, another story I might cover in the future. Bremen docked briefly in Bermuda before carrying on with her hunt for the ship, but come April, no trace of the Augsburg was found. Even as the Titanic was sinking hundreds of miles to the north, the search was ongoing for the SS Augsburg. On April 13th, the Marconi Wireless Company stationed at Cape Ray signaled the passenger liner Yipiranga to help with the search. On April 20th, another cargo ship called the Caledonia arrived in Norfolk and was sent a telegram to search as well, and she headed out to sea 2 days later. Another DADG ship, the Magdeburg, which had arrived in New York on the same day as her fellow DADG ship Augsburg, left to search too, following Augsburg's route to Durban. On this search, she encountered a severe storm which cleared after about a day, and there was fear that Augsburg had foundered in a storm or in that very storm if she was still afloat up to that point. The fear was very real. There were also false reports starting to come in of Augsburg being sighted floating, but no trace was ever found. She was gone. The Sun reported, "The hunt for the Augsburg. Caledonia ordered to search the Atlantic for crippled steamer. Under hurried orders from Hamburg, the Hamburg American liner Caledonia will leave tomorrow morning to search for the German steamer Augsburg, which was reported broken down and adrift in the Atlantic a few days ago. A cablegram ordering the Caledonia to search for the Augsburg was received by Captain Roll upon his arrival from Veracruz yesterday for bunker coal. Following the receipt of the cable, Captain Roll gave orders that all the coal that his vessel would carry with safety be put on board, as he expects to make a thorough search." This paper also reported that the steamer Augsburg was broken down and drifting at latitude 38 degrees north, longitude 58 degrees west, adding that she had lost a propeller. I don't know where they got those coordinates. If you plug them into Google Maps, it's in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. It seems like they were just making up a position for the ship. As far as I can tell, there was no sighting of her in the area around this time. So what happened? A proposed explanation many support is that the ship sank in a storm, perhaps one that struck after she left, or the one that struck a month later if she was indeed broken down in a drift. I could not find any source on why the paper printed that the propeller was theorized to be lost, but perhaps there was some truth to that, and she drifted for a month before sinking in a storm. There seemed to be a lot of hope that the ship was afloat until that storm hit in April. Perhaps the storm overwhelmed the ship, causing her to roll over and go under, lost to the depths of the ocean. Given the time of year and the sheer number of icebergs in the North Atlantic Ocean that year, she might have run into an iceberg which had drifted far south. Iceberg collisions have sunk far more ships than the Titanic, and depending on the type of collision this theoretical event dealt to the ship, she might have sank slowly or very quickly. Also, the cargo she was carrying is something to consider. Petroleum is highly flammable and combustible, and kerosene being in the vicinity would not help anything either if there was even a single spark. What if a fire broke out on board the ship which sank her, or even caused a sudden explosion that destroyed the ship instantly and caused it to sink almost instantly? The ocean is big, and the fact no debris was sighted doesn't mean something like this couldn't have occurred. And given the age of the ship, it's likely that she didn't have a wireless set ever installed, so even if she drifted for a month, it's very likely she could have been missed without any way to call for help. Maybe this led to something like the Mary Celeste occurring, where the crew left the ship in the lifeboats to try and set off and reach land, leaving the ship drifting empty until she eventually sank, perhaps in the same storm it was suspected she was lost in. Who knows? Maybe they even had a worst-case scenario. Iceberg strike, cargo explosion all at once, or maybe just one of those. Maybe it was a storm. Maybe it was something else altogether. We just don't know and won't until we find the wreck, but this would be one that I bet is only found by sheer random chance if it ever is. Projects to map the entire ocean floor have been proposed, and if they ever come to fruition, I'm sure multiple lost ships will be rediscovered. But to this day, absolutely no trace of the ship has ever been found. Not even a lifebelt with her name on it. If her wreck ever is found, we might be able to learn what sank her, be it fire, iceberg damage, or something else. If she is found, as damaged as she might be, she might still bear the clues of what caused her fate. Where the ship is today, though, is likely a mystery that will never be solved. But who knows? Maybe one day she'll be spotted and found. And I think the lack of answers is also in part why the mystery has been forgotten. And why whatever fate befell this ship on the icy Atlantic Ocean has been possibly lost forever to knowledge, along with the fates of those she was carrying. Unlike Titanic, there are no incredible stories to be retold over and over. For Augsburg, there's just nothing. It's like she was never even here. She is out there somewhere, though. A rusting wreck forgotten on the ocean floor, waiting to be found again. It's interesting that something mysterious like this happened only 2 months before the Titanic sank, and continued to play out during and after she sank, but it's never talked about. Why some ships are forgotten and why some are remembered is just a fascinating thing to me. Some of the forgotten stories are just as mesmerizing as the famous ones. I wonder if this mystery would be more well known if the Titanic hadn't sunk around the same time, or if it would have still faded into obscurity. It probably would have. The fact the Titanic never did either was kind of an anomaly in and of itself. But in this hypothetical scenario, I would say the mystery would likely have been more of a sensation at the time. Maybe something more along the lines of the reaction to the Wartime disappearing in July 1909. Either way, I'll continue to tell the stories of the famous and obscure, and I hope you'll stick around to listen to them. Maybe this mystery will be solved one day. Who knows, maybe her wreck will be found in a very unexpected place, and this story has a few twists we don't know about yet. With the unknowns, anything could have happened. You'd think that if a ship exploded, nearly its whole crew died in what has to be one of the most horrific ways that a human being can, and caused a catastrophic environmental disaster, that it would be something remembered, or at least widely known about, simply because of the gravity of it all, right? Well, in this case it wasn't, and this is one that occurred not too long ago either. In 1979, the crude oil carrier MT Independența collided with a freighter in Turkey and exploded. Nearly her entire crew died. She burned for weeks. The ocean floor was buried under a heavy oil residue that sank, and the sea and air for miles in all directions was heavily polluted from the smoke and the spill. This is the story of what befell in the MT Independența disaster, and how it happened, what happened, and the fire, pollution, and death that it left in its wake. The MT Independența, or the Independence, was a Romanian crude oil carrier. She was completed in 1978. She was 928 feet long, 150 feet wide, her depth was 72 feet, and her tonnage was 164,004 tons deadweight. She was the biggest ship in her country's commercial fleet at the time of her completion, though she was not the largest ship to ever sail of that particular kind. That honor still goes to the more than 1,500-foot-long self-propelled supertanker Knock Nevis. However, Independența was still a large beast. You couldn't miss her sailing past. After her completion and launch, her initial service was by the book and routine, and not much is recorded by it. It was all mundane, which is what you want when you have a ship, especially one that carries the kind of things the Independența did. You don't want incidents. However, things would not stay by the book, and what is known most about her is her loss. And it's one of few that I've covered that there is footage of, and it's haunting footage. Unfortunately, due to copyright restrictions, I cannot actually show the footage, but you can find it on YouTube. It is haunting, horrifying, and honestly looks like something you'd see in a montage at the start of an apocalypse movie or something similar. What you see here, though, is the result of the Greek cargo ship MV Evriali accidentally colliding with the Independence, which was carrying at the time 94,000 tons of crude oil. Independența dropped her anchor 4 nautical miles from the southern entrance of the Istanbul Strait, also known as the Bosphorus Strait, which is a significant waterway for international trade in Istanbul, Turkey, that connects to the Black Sea. Independența was waiting for a pilot to come in and guide her in on what would be her 19th pass through the strait. It was a pass she never made. On the morning of November 15th, 1979, the Evriali, which was transporting over 7,000 tons of steel from Ukraine, collided with the Independența, striking her between tanks numbers 3 and 4. It was caused by a navigation error or simple miscommunication, perhaps. Truly, it, to this day, is not exactly clear why it happened. The Greek ship was supposed to take a turn 260 degrees right, but instead she went 160 to the left. This horrific image on screen is the aftermath. The collision occurred between 4:30 and 5:30 a.m. I've seen different sources cite different times within that hour, and 43 of the 46 of Independența's crew were killed in the explosion. Their burned bodies were recovered after they washed ashore. All absolutely just scorched almost beyond recognition. The other 3 survived. Those who were killed that didn't die in the initial explosion died when the water's surface, where they were swimming, erupted into flames from the spilling oil flowing out of the tanker like blood. The 3 who survived only did so because they jumped off the ship away from the wind, against the wind basically, and they were picked up in the water by boats. Meanwhile, behind them, the fire and smoke was being carried towards the shore. In the explosion itself, it was so loud that local citizens flew into a panic. Houses had their windows smashed in. Buildings as far as 6 kilometers away were damaged. And as the people looked out, they saw the eerie, orange glow coming from the strait as the tanker burned. Honestly, it just sounds like a nightmare scene. Again, like something you'd only see in a movie. The description of this apocalyptic scene, honestly, is just making me think of something like the atomic breath scene from Godzilla -1. The explosion was caused by sparks as a result of damage from the collision. The explosion occurred 3 minutes after the collision. I can only imagine how the crew were responding to the collision when all of a sudden their ship just exploded. A second explosion followed the first a few minutes later. A third explosion occurred roughly 10 minutes after the collision. 30,000 tons of oil burned, and the rest, some 64,000 tons, flowed into the sea. The Turkish Navy immediately responded and attempted to extinguish the fire, but it proved too intense, and they had to abandon the attempt. The Navy withdrew on November 19th after another agency took over the spill operation. The strait was closed for weeks. The fire burned for 27 days, and it was a disaster on the environment. There was a thick black layer of oil on the sea from the spill. Crude oil and other residue that wasn't burned away sank to the sea floor across a 5.5 kilometer area, and up to 96% of sea animals living on the ocean floor in the area are estimated to have died. And oil coated the shoreline for miles, including on recreational beaches that were forced to be closed. Additional explosions also struck the tanker on November 18th and on December 6th, and she continued to burn until December 14th. So what else happened because of all this? Well, obviously there was a legal investigation into the cause, though, as I mentioned, a surefire answer to the exact cause for this disaster is not clear to this day. Some sources I read concluded that the Greek vessel that struck the tanker was to blame, but some also argued that it went down the other way and that the Independența struck the Greek tanker. Though the exact cause does remain unknown, some theories suggest it could have been anything from an accident to even a deliberate insurance fraud case that resulted in the incident. Not going to get conspiratorial, but I just thought all were worth mentioning. The captain of the Greek ship that hit the Independența, however, was, along with 7 crew, charged with negligence and being careless, as well as disobeying international maritime regulations and putting the security of Istanbul at risk. The captain was sentenced to 20 months in prison, however, was released in respect to the 7 he served during the trial. The International Tanker Owners Pollution Federation Limited also responded to the spill several times in the first 9 months after the incident, helping to determine the extent of the spill and contamination and provide support for the cleanup and response. It was found that most of the oil was thankfully burned up in the fire, and only places with major contamination were the shorelines and some areas of the seafloor. The wreck of the Independența was left at the site of the accident for years until she was broken up and salvaged in 1983 after a ferry struck it. In 2000, one of Independența's sister ships lost power in the same strait that her sister exploded, but there was no damage, thankfully, as a result of this later incident, and not another environmental catastrophe like this one at all. Another of the 4 sisters, though, sunk in 1982, and a theory is that she struck a World War II-era mine, though the wreck today shows no signs of fault in the construction on that ship itself. And of the 5 sister ships, only one is still in service to this day, the one that lost power in 2000, actually. The others were either sunk, never completed, or broken up. That's all there really is to say about this incident. This horrific incident that I'm honestly shocked I'd never heard of before. This feels like something you'd hear more about, but even a lot of the sources I read had some conflicting information on the time the collision occurred, the extent of the spill, the impact on the environment, how much oil burned. It was hard to get a crystal clear picture of this because, well, it seems like there isn't a crystal clear picture of all of it. And I bet some of the true impacts of it will only be known in the years to come. This, though, it just feels like something you know more about, and it just feels like another one of the incidents I'm surprised there's not a movie about, especially nowadays with concern of our impact on the environment, that we have. It could be one that really sticks with people if it was done well, like Deepwater Horizon did. Deepwater Horizon's not a movie I've rewatched several times, but it stuck with me after I saw it. And I feel like this story could have the same impact if people knew about it. but the story has fallen into obscurity, though. At least in the US, it might be known more over in Turkey, but over here, I'd never heard of it, and I actually only found this story while looking for another, even more obscure incident I wanted to talk about that actually did get a movie made about it, and it was one that involved a fertilizer ship that exploded. I couldn't track that one down. I'm gonna try again in the future, but I'm happy I stumbled across this story. I think it was absolutely worth talking about, and tell me, had you ever heard of it before? Anyways, also, what do you think of this incident? And what do you think was the cause, if there was only one, or if there were several factors that came together in just the worst way it could have? And who do you think was truly at fault, if anyone? Tell me in the comments, and tell me what you think of this story. This last segment here has kind of just been an off-scripted rant, but I just had a lot I wanted to just discuss with this story, and just my thoughts on it all. I'm not going to do like a whole dedicated my thoughts section like I did with the Arctic video, but yeah, this was something that I definitely think should be talked about, and I hope that you agree and took something from this story. Her name in ancient Hebrew meant lovely or grace, and when she was launched in 1826, she perhaps lived up to the splendor of that name and its promise. They called her the Hannah. Yet, on April 29, 1849, while on a voyage across the Atlantic Ocean, carrying those on board who hoped to escape starvation and desolation, calamity struck her and those on board her, and she represented anything but what her name promised. In the following disaster, her captain, in an act that has come to be known as the most cowardly act by a ship's captain in the annals of maritime history, ordered her passengers to be trapped below decks during the sinking, and only the sudden deviation by one of his crew prevented an even worse catastrophe than what ultimately happened aboard the Hannah, before she vanished forever below the ocean. 49 lives were lost. Not enough to list her among the great disasters in history, but what happened on her during this disaster is enough to cement her as one of the most horrific on a human and moral level nonetheless. This is the forgotten disaster that befell the brig Hannah, and the terrible event that forever embedded her in the dark parts of history we wish to forget. Would you board something called a coffin ship? For many, there was no choice. During the Great Famine, also known as the Great Hunger, Irish immigrants were often left without a choice if they wished to escape. The Great Hunger describes the period from 1845 to 1852 that saw mass starvation and disease spreading in Ireland. This period of social upheaval was caused due to the collapse of the potato crop, leading to it also being known as the Irish Potato Famine. The worst year of the entire famine was 1847. It was so bad that it became remembered by survivors as Black 47. During the famine, around 1 million people died and more than 1 million more fled the country altogether. One method they often employed were vessels known as coffin ships. Coffin ships were the cheapest, in many cases literally all families could afford, vessels available for people to escape Ireland at the time. However, immigrants who used these ships were confined in cramped conditions with other passengers, hence the name of the ships, with poor food and water access. Owners of these ships offered as little living space, food, and water as was legally allowed. The conditions on many of these ships were so bad that they led to disease spreading between individuals, leading to the 1847 North American typhus epidemic, and many people, sometimes entire families, dying on the journey from Ireland. Death rates on these ships were anywhere between 20% to sometimes even more on average. Sometimes it was even as high as 50% of all those on board. It was said at the time that entire shivers of sharks could be seen following these ships throughout the voyages due to the sheer number of bodies that were thrown overboard on each crossing. Can you imagine that? You're fleeing with your family from a famine so bad that you'll starve if you stay, but the type of ship that you can afford has such a high death rate that dozens, if not more, sharks are following you the entire time you're at sea. it takes the words away. Now, all this backstory leads us to one ship with the name Hannah. The Hannah was a brig launched in 1826, and as was mentioned in the intro, one definition of her name meant lovely or grace. Perhaps she lived up to it, with the sight of her sails unfurled and catching the wind and her bow slicing through the water proudly. She was registered under the name Hannah in 1840 at Mayport, England. She was 287 gross registered tons. Her crew were her captain and 12 others, and she could carry within her below-deck accommodations a total of 200 people. During the Irish famine, she brought immigrants, sometimes crammed in so tightly that they numbered over 300 in a single crossing, to Canada from Ireland under the command of her captain, John Briggs, though on what would be her final voyage, she was commanded by a 23-year-old captain named Curry Shaw, son of the ship's owner. We quickly come through her story to 1849 without major incident befalling her. On Tuesday, April 3rd, 1849, Hannah set sail from Ireland bound for Canada. Now, the exact number of those on board is lost to time, as the ship's list and log were lost, but it was somewhere around 150 passengers on this crossing, if not more, due to the count of the living and the dead that was done later, and I'll touch on that number later. She was taking immigrants from Ireland to Quebec City in Quebec, Canada. After setting sail from Warren Point and Newry, she sailed into the Gulf of St. Lawrence on April 3rd, 1849. Discovered and first documented in 1534, the Gulf of St. Lawrence can be found along the shorelines of Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, and Labrador, Canada. It also connects to the Great Lakes through the St. Lawrence River. On the north side, it is bounded by the Labrador Peninsula in Quebec and Newfoundland to the east. On the west, it is bounded by New Brunswick and the Gaspé Peninsula. Multiple islands can be found dotted throughout the Gulf, and multiple rivers alongside the St. Lawrence empty into the Gulf. The Gulf is also home to various marine animals and has several branches, including one familiar to viewers of this channel if you've been around for a minute, the Northumberland Strait. And finally, the Gulf flows into the North Atlantic Ocean through the Strait of Belle Isle, the Strait of Canso, and the Cobalt Strait. Another feature of note in the Gulf is the very noticeable undersea feature known as the Laurentinian Channel, which formed during the last ice ages. In some areas, the bottom has also become hypoxic. On April 27th, after the Hannah entered the Gulf, the first ominous signs were sighted. The water began kicking up, spray landing on the deck, and the ship encountered heavy waves and a quantity of floating ice throughout the day. This was only the prelude for what was to come. Choppy seas and high winds would only go on to be one problem among the many that were coming. None of those on board could have dared to guess what would happen next. She, and everyone on board her, was sailing towards hell. Early in the morning on April 29th, the Hannah was still sailing along through the Gulf, carrying the immigrants within her towards what they hoped would be a better life. Her charges housed below might have been trying to get some sleep. Others maybe were thinking about what was waiting for them at the end of the harsh voyage. None of them knew that many of them would make it, yes, but with their entire worlds shattered forever anyways. A very cruel twist of fate was about to strike them who had already been dealt a very cruel twist of fate. At 4 a.m. that morning, the ship, as it encountered a large quantity of floating ice and was trying to make her way through it, suddenly struck what survivors called a reef of ice. It's a vivid description of just how much ice and how tightly packed together it must have been. The ice punched a hole into the hull of the nearly 300-ton brig. It was quickly discovered that the ship was beyond saving, and Shaw issued a command that has become known as the most cowardly act by a ship's captain in the annals of maritime history, when he ordered the Hannah's carpenter to nail shut the hatch to the passenger areas, trapping all of the immigrants inside the sinking ship. Shaw had already gained an infamous reputation before this act. On an earlier voyage, he had crammed almost 400 immigrants below decks, and due to the terrible living conditions, many had died at sea during the crossing. After issuing his command to trap the passengers, Shaw and 2 of his officers took the ship's only lifeboat and left everyone else on board to fend for themselves, or rather, more accurately, left them all to die. The ship's doctor, Dr. Graham, jumped overboard and swam after them, and later claimed he was forced away from the boat by the ship's captain, swinging a cutlass at him when he tried to approach. With the captain and first and second officers having fled the ship, vanishing into the only lifeboat in the gale that was raging around the ship still, raining sleet and blowing sprays of freezing water onto the ship, another seaman ripped the board off the hatch to the passenger areas, freeing the passengers. They had less than an hour now to escape or find a way to do so. As the Hannah began sinking, water gushing into her open wound, her commanders vanishing into the distance with the only lifeboat and escaping with their lives, the few crew left on the sinking brig tried to organize what evacuation they could. With the lifeboat gone, they began ushering passengers off the Hannah and on to an ice floe alongside of the ship. A desperate move, but one of the only options they had. Keep in mind, they were clinging to a slick piece of ice amid a gale with roaring wind and icy sheets of sleet raining down on them, and with frigid waves drenching them. Others remained on the ship, and amid the calamity in this frozen place, the closest thing to hell some people can think of was falling upon those on board the Hannah. Some people remained clinging to the Hannah, slipping free and falling into the water, or going down with the ship. One man named John Murphy placed his twin sons on an ice floe alongside the ship, then went below again to search for his infant daughter. He found her, alive despite being submerged in the freezing water, and hurried back up on deck. The piece of ice holding his sons floated away from the ship and was lost in the waves and the wind. He never saw them again. Another passenger, Anne McGinn, was able to gather all 6 of her children despite the chaos, but none of them survived the sinking either. However, she did. Many others died from freezing in the water, and likely some were even crushed by the ice. The crew who did remain on the ship mostly remained on board the Hannah until the end. In a quick act of thinking, as the ship was within her final moments before slipping under the waves, they scrambled and grabbed blankets and other things to keep people as warm as they might. The Hannah's stern then rose up into the air and went down, and she was gone. The scene was described as such in the following article published in the London Guardian, published on June 4th, 1849. There were several feet of water in the hold, and it was rapidly increasing. As the only chance of keeping the ship afloat, a cry was raised to keep the pumps until assistance could be obtained from some passing vessel, and also, it is presumed, to allow the boats being prepared for the rescue of the immigrants. What steps were taken to secure their preservation, no mention is made in the report received. A charge, however, is laid against the master and first and second officers of their having been guilty of one of the most revolting acts of inhumanity possible to be conceived. They had got the lifeboat out, and the moment they found the vessel would inevitably go down, they jumped into it, and abandoned the wreck with the living mass on board. The gurgling noise of the water rising in her hold intimidated to the helpless creatures of their perilous situation. Already was the lower deck covered, too forcefully showing that her foundering was near at hand. The terrible scene that here ensued may be briefly told as one of the most agonizing description scarcely to be depicted. Their screams for help rent the air, and it was the only chance left of saving their lives. As well as, the last to leave the wreck were some of the crew, who contrived to save a small portion of spirits and a few blankets. Soon after they had got clear, the ship's stern rose, as it were, above the water, and she went down head foremost just 40 minutes after the collision with the ice. The sufferings of the wretched creatures, exposed as they were amid the towering masses of ice, with a raging, freezing gale of wind from the SSE, were most harrowing. The seamen who were amongst them humanely gave up what covering they had to the females, who had been shockingly wounded and bruised in their course over the ice. Thus were they exposed the whole of that day till 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when a vessel hove in sight and bore down to the field of ice. It's a hard passage to read. and the full thing is much longer. I'll leave it in the description. But the mention of the crew taking off their own clothes and giving it to the passengers, just to give them that little extra bit of insulation, it's tough to read. So what happened after all of this catastrophe? Well, the rescue ship mentioned in the passage was the bark Nicaragua, commanded by Captain William Marshall. What a sight she must have been to see for those who had been on the Hannah. Her breaking through the ice after a day, floating on the ice or clinging to the ice itself, in some cases hardly wearing any clothes at all. Before the day was ended, she was joined by 3 other ships in the rescue efforts, plucking half-frozen people out of the frigid sea. 49 lives were lost in the sinking. Out of the 176 in total on board, 127 were saved. Obviously, this number is higher than the tentative one I mentioned earlier, but since it was counted there on the site, I'm going to guess that this is a more accurate number. Maybe not totally right, but a more accurate number of the actual number of those who were on board, since it was counted at the site of the sinking. And Shaw and his officers in the lifeboats were rescued as well by the vessel Margaret Pollock. They were charged with being guilty of one of the most revolting acts of inhumanity that can be conceived. The article, The Wreck of the Hannah in 1849, added, "It would appear that great blame is to be attached to Captain Shaw in his melancholy affair, whose cowardice and inhumanity are said to have been conspicuous throughout." Unlike a movie where they would face justice, real life is cold. There was no justice. They escaped all charges. This was despite a disposition being given by the ship's doctor and other crew members describing in detail what Shaw and the other 2 officers who had fled the boat had done. Shaw and his officers, nonetheless, walked away free men. I really needed some time to process this one. I've told some of the stories with just the worst of humanity on display. The Arctic, the La Bourgogne, but this one really stands out among them in just one of the very worst ways. I try not to swear on this channel, but what the hell? Normally these kinds of stories aren't forgotten, but this one seems to have been. It has fallen into those dark cracks of history we like to look the other way from. A captain ordering the passengers on his sinking ship to be locked below deck. If it was at all a more famous shipwreck, or heck, even one as well known as the Titanic, which, has a myth that something like this actually happened on it, his name would be dragged through the mud for all of history, and you know what, rightfully so. There are others who have had their names wrongly dragged through the mud in stories associated with shipwrecks, and some still persist to this day, but it seems that someone who actually deserved it escaped it. I like to think that if there is a hell, there's a special place in it for people like him. These are the kinds of stories, though, that I think need to be told, and I'm happy I finally got this video out to you all. They need to be told and remembered so that the dead can be remembered, and so we don't repeat the mistakes that led to the wrongful deaths of those who died on the Hannah, which, considering the conditions the ship sank in, I'm amazed was not a higher death toll, if I'm honest. One silver lining in this whole story was that it was not higher. And also remember that despite the horror that went down on the ship, there were good people on board too who did try to help the passengers to the very end. Some of the accounts I read of some of the crew are some of the most selfless I've ever read. It's quite the contrast to the captain. Those names we should also remember and celebrate. In 1941, one of the worst maritime disasters in history occurred, with a death toll far greater than more famous disasters like the Titanic, which leaves me surprised that this isn't among those more widely known disasters. When this ship sank, possibly 7,000 people went with it, but this story has been almost completely forgotten. So today I'm telling you the story of the Soviet hospital ship Armina and the horrific disaster that befell her and those she was carrying on November 7th, 1941. The Armenia was built in 1928 at the Baltic shipyards in modern-day St. Petersburg. She was part of a fleet of liners designed for use in the Black Sea. This transport ship was among the very first passenger liners to be built for the Soviet Union, which only formed 6 years earlier. She was a transport and passenger liner, and then later on a hospital ship, all in one. She weighed 4,727 gross registered tons, she was 367 feet long, her beam was 51 feet, and she was propelled by twin shafts that could plow her ahead at a speed of 13 knots. Armenia was designed to carry 1,000 tons of cargo, along with roughly 550 passengers within her first, second, and third class accommodations. Passengers could enjoy luxury and many activities. And due to a shallow water draft as well, she could get through shallow water ports that would be hazardous to other ships, such as those in the Crimean Peninsula. Throughout the first decade of her career, the 5 sister ships in the fleet were reliable vessels for passenger service, as well as for carrying mail and cargo between the various ports throughout the Black Sea. Then World War II started. The Armenia and her sisters were not immediately requisitioned by the Soviet Union. That didn't happen until Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. This is when she was turned into a hospital and troop transport ship. The German army had cut off the Crimean Peninsula, and the only way out for the Soviets was by sea. Armenia was repainted with red crosses that told everyone she was a hospital ship, and her task was removing wounded Soviet soldiers from the front line, along with medical personnel and civilians, and taking them to a safe location. This was a duty she carried out for less than 5 months. On the nights of November 6th and 7th, 1941, the Armenia took on thousands of passengers, placing their trust in the ship and her crew. They were going to be escaping from Sevastopol as the city fell into chaos. While the city would indeed prove strong enough to withstand the German siege for 9 months, at this time it seemed like the city would fall any day and many were trying to escape. Armenia took entire Soviet hospital staffs on, and civilian officials and their families, along with thousands of additional wounded soldiers. They were bound for Tuapse, a town 250 miles away along the northeastern coast of the Black Sea. Having taken on her passengers far more than she was ever designed to carry, and as they settled in within her accommodations, the crowded Armenia left port in the early hours of November 7th. Almost immediately, her captain received orders to pick up even more passengers in Yalta. They did so, and thousands more wounded soldiers and refugee civilians were taken on board. No exact counts were kept here, but it was thousands of additional people, bringing her passenger total somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 people. Remember, she was only designed to carry 550 passengers. At 7 a.m., the ship finally left, with her captain eager to get underway with some darkness still providing cover for the overloaded vessel. However, they were delayed from leaving earlier by additional orders that they had to wait for an escort, which finally arrived and consisted of only 2 armed boats and 2 fighter planes. The reason for such light security might have been that, in the Black Sea, the Germans and other Axis powers only had limited number of surface vessels. The Soviets never lost full control of the sea throughout the war. However, despite having the sea itself under their control, the Axis powers did control the skies above the sea. And it was so bad that only the most heavily armed and heavily escorted ships could even have a hope or a prayer to make it across the sea afloat. Armenia did not have that. She had 2 armed boats and 2 planes to protect her. Ships caught in the western part of the sea alone or with a light escort were almost guaranteed to be sunk, or at the very least attacked and forced to limp to shore. If you look at the map on screen, the ship did not make it far from Yalta. You can see how far she was from her destination when it all went wrong. At 11:30, only 25 miles from Yalta, the worst came to pass. Armina and her escort were spotted. A group of German bombers flew overhead, and Arminia's crew and their escort most definitely realized what was coming for them. They had very light anti-aircraft abilities, and her Red Crosses presented a bullseye target for the bombers. The bombers dove and attacked. They fought their way through the two escort planes, and one of them dropped 2 torpedoes at the hospital ship. One torpedo missed. The other scored a direct hit on the Armenia. Her back was broken by the blow. Witnesses said she split in half and sank in 4 minutes. And of the between 5,000 to 7,000 people on board, there were only 8 survivors, and they were picked up by the escort vessels, who could only watch as the ship they were supposed to protect sank quickly right next to them, gone in what had to have been the blink of an eye. The lowest, most conservative, most lenient estimate for the dead, 5,000 people. In those short 4 minutes, at least 5,000 people died. Even with that number in mind, to this day, this remains one of the deadliest maritime disasters ever, and the deadliest sinking of a single ship in Russian and Soviet Union history. It is consistently listed within the top 3 to 5 worst single ship maritime disasters in history. And Armenia was not alone in being lost. All 4 of her sister ships shared her fate throughout the war. But that was not the end of the story. The wreck of this little remembered ship proved to be of interest to many historians and shipwreck enthusiasts, and many set out to look for her, but she proved to be very elusive to find. The Australian company Geo Renaissance claimed that using an undisclosed remote sensing technique that they located her in 2005 at 250 meters below the surface, but if this is true is unknown. However, in 2020, the Russian Geographical Society also claimed to have located the wreck of the Armenia. At first, they were not sure what they had seen on sonar looked like the ship, but they couldn't identify it from just that. In April 2020, however, it was confirmed that the wreck was in fact the Armenia when they sent ROVs down to investigate it, and they located many unique characteristics of the vessel, as well as one of her bells, which clearly still showed her name standing at the stern of the ship. How many bombs struck the ship could not be officially determined. Many accounts, however, to this day claim it was just one. The wreck is also, despite what was said by witnesses, to be in one piece. But she did in fact sink very quickly, due to the fact that multiple windows are smashed inward all across the wreck, indicating there were still large amounts of air inside the ship after she was already underwater. After nearly a century, we now know for sure where she is, and where thousands of people now rest. Hopefully, with future dives, final mysteries of this shipwreck will be solved in a way that is respectful and does not disturb the wreck. At this time, no additional dive to the gravesite are planned. Today, her wreck remains the remnant of one of the most forgotten, but horrific and deadly maritime disasters in all of history. One of many overshadowed by the conflict they were lost in.